All right, I think we are live. Welcome in. Welcome in. Welcome to the stream. We're going to be discussing creating IT processes today with an IT process expert, somebody that consults with so many people on how to get their IT processes and IT departments and MSPs and everything in order so that you can create the best processes and more efficient IT departments. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it. It seems like we have a good stream of people jumping in early. So really happy to have y'all here. For those of y'all that are new to the IT Leadership Lab, this is a community dedicated to IT leaders of all different kinds of companies of different shapes and sizes. So we've got IT managers, new IT managers, all the way up to CIOs in here collaborating with each other and learning from each other. So we host these streams once every other week to bring on experts in the field to discuss various IT topics. And today we're going to be discussing IT processes. So as we go along, feel free to drop any questions that you have in the chat, and I will kind of filter them through to Brendan. But Brendan's going to give y'all an awesome presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to you, Brendan, if you want to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your journey in IT, and also a little bit about Gozynta as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much for having me, Brittany.
Oh, thank you.
So my name's Brendan. I'm the president of consulting with Gozynta Consulting. We started as an MSP. So we know the pains, the struggles, the headaches that most MSP deal with, from just beginning with a handful of techs to having many teams. So whether you're just starting the documentation process or looking really to refine your existing documentation, we're going to go through how the process, which is the process that leads all other processes, to either improve or start creating your IT process journey. So the first thing is that process, we have to create a culture. Creating the culture of processes is critical in the success of any documentation. My name's Brendan. I'm the president of consulting. I've been in service delivery for about 12 years. I've been a leader for 16. I've led teams as large as 125 people to as small as 3. I am ITIL 4 certified, and the documentations are for Gozynta Consulting. And I'm going to get into what that means in just a little bit. If you have questions as I'm going through this, I welcome them. So please drop them in the chat so that I can answer them live. First, why do we create processes? It's the leaky bucket syndrome. The leaky bucket syndrome typically sounds like a disease, but it's not. What happens is we pass information from one person to the other. They in turn pass information to the next person. When they train the new recruit, they get good at their job, but half of the information that they originally learned doesn't get passed on. And it doesn't get passed on because we forget, we may not deem it as important. And in processes, the details are important. So as we continue to bring on new people and pass that on, that bucket of information gets smaller and smaller. So processes, holistically, at the end, the bucket's empty. Half of the process that we put in place is gone, forgotten, maybe it didn't get passed down, and you look at it and say, well, I trained Joey to do this correctly, but Joey missed parts of it. So as we put information into the bucket and patch the holes with processes, all of the information, now gets to the entire team. Now, when we think of processes, we think of a few different things. A process is a series of actions that lead to a particular result. Now, this can be internal. So your internal SOP or processes for account creation, it could be for new user onboardings, it could be for how to work tickets, because that's important. The documentation that we write is a written form in an accessible place of decisions that you've made. So we've made a whole bunch of decisions. It's important to pass those on. Decisions are what we're documenting, where we're putting that information, and how we're sharing that. A culture is a widely accepted way of doing things of a particular group of people. So documentation should be referred at every step of the stage. So if we have a process for creating a new client, a new user, and that user has to get X amount of licenses, that needs to be in the process. The process defines the who, what, where, when, why, and most importantly, the how. So it's the 5 W's and an H. Every process that we have should start with the why. It's the blueprint of all your documentation. The where should be simple decision. What documentation platforms are we using? You have specialized documentation platforms like ITIL and Hoodoo, but we've had great success in documenting in Confluence and Google Drive, SharePoint. The place matters, but not as much as knowing where to find it. Some people have internal processes in Google Drive and simple documents, or SharePoint or Confluence. Client information, different kind of documentation, is better held in places like IT Glue. Why? Because you can create templates. Templates can help really streamline that process of creating and referring to documentation. If you require information such as a network map with IP addresses, that should be in the documentation, typically held in IT Glue, Hoodoo, or any other documentation platform. Now, who's responsible? The who is responsible for the overall process and review of said process during everyday activity. The documentation czar is accountable to the processes, but not all the work has to be done or written by the documentation czar. Processes are everybody in the organization's responsibility. Documentation of a client's configuration is everybody's job in the organization to keep that documentation updated. I want you to think of the last time you went to client documentation, you needed a password for something, but the password that you have on file was incorrect. Maybe somebody changed the password and didn't log it. How frustrated were you that you couldn't get into that? And how long did it take to just get into the simple program? It's frustrating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually had a question, and I don't know if it's something that you might be covering later in the slide, but Gabriel had a couple of questions. Is there an ideal timeline for documentation for an MSP? And then are there certain markers for documentation or quality levels of documentation? This might be something that you cover a little bit later on, but.
So there's both. The ideal timeline is now.
Mm-hmm.
The sooner that you start creating your documentation, the easier it is to bring somebody in and onboard them.
Mm-hmm.
When your documentation, whether it's onboarding for new hires. It's easier to send them to the documentation and the processes, and reduces the amount of time for hands-on training.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, it doesn't eliminate that, but the sooner you start the documentation, the better.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as quality, it doesn't have to be perfect the first time around. We create our documentation in iterations. So we may create the step-by-step on the first round.
Mm-hmm.
The second round, which I'm going to caution on this one, because when you add screenshots to your documentation of any kind, it goes out of date a lot faster than not keeping those, than just having text.
Mm-hmm.
We assume in the documentation that our team is trained on the software to be able to follow the steps.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to get it close the first round, but your documentation is going to evolve. If we're talking about processes, yeah, it's going to take you an extra 15, 20 minutes to write down the first one.
Mm-hmm.
To edit it down the line, you may need to add a line here or there. So don't let perfection get in the way of progress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Hopefully that helped answer a couple of your questions, Gabriel. I'm sure we'll also cover some of these points too.
Absolutely. So the when, which I believe is your question, everyone's responsible, right, through change management. Typically, we recommend that even at the seedling level, team sizes of less than 6 starts writing documentation. As we evolve down into the sapling, new growth, old growth, the documentations are and review processes are typically more streamlined. So everybody's still responsible for creating the documentation. The approval of the documentation as your organization grows actually narrows into a change management process, which is a whole nother webinar.
We would be happy to have you on to dive into that too.
So the how. When we talk about the how, we typically talk about naming standards and being clear. Your outline of the process should always start with the why and the purpose of the process. Why was this process written? You should have the body of the process, the SOP. If you do have templates saved for client documentation or organizational settings, those should be in the body. The next steps is after you've completed this, what do we do next? And we should always have a revision history at the bottom. Specialized software like ITIL and Hoodoo is pretty great at keeping a revision history so that you can always refer back to a previous version if needed. So when we talk about the how, we want to be clear and specific about what's inside the document when naming it. Think about what someone would typically search for. If we can add tags to the documentation to make it easy to find, that would be ideal. We want to include commonly used slang, acronyms, client short names, names of product that might be involved, any other terms that might make the global search easier. When we're talking about creating processes, the navigation is less important than the search terms used to find it. So this is just an example to how we would set up the template. We'd create the why, the purpose, explain the reason behind the document so the next person knows that they found the right document. So if you're creating a document for an error, the purpose of the document should be to resolve the error. It should include the error exactly as it appears, and it should have resolution steps to fix it, or at least troubleshooting steps so that they can at least do the troubleshooting before they escalate it to the next tier.
Actually, did have a question from Suzanne regarding screenshots and documentation for non-IT staff as well. They say that the general staff at my company are the absolute polar opposite of technical and they need detailed step-by-step instructions. I use Scribe, making updating those screenshots and step-by-steps much easier. So what's the difference between documentation for technical versus non-technical, and are screenshots, okay to use in those situations?
Screenshots are okay to use in those situations. Typically, our recommendation is that if it's for non-technical, screenshots do great at absolutely helping to show when and where. The problem with screenshots is that in the ever-evolving space of software development, those screenshots may be outdated by the next iteration of that program. Scribe is fantastic at taking those screenshots as you do it. It makes it very, very easy to update it. If you were doing that manually, how much more time is that going to add to creating the documentation? So if it's for non-technical, yeah, those screenshots are great. Just understand that you may have to update that document or that process a lot more frequently than you would if there were no screenshots. Does that?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's great. Yeah, thank you.
So when we talk about naming standards, we have organizational best practices and naming standard best practices. So when we're organizing your documents, the structure should really be preset as a template. So, and internally for us, we have our strategy documents in one place, and then we have our direction, which is our core values, alignment like that. And then we have our tactics. Tactics are your everyday processes. So typically it's grouped by department. So marketing has a folder. Inside that folder, marketing may have processes or knowledge base articles that are within that to help every day. Naming practices. Typically, you want to name the document with a preceding either SOP, KB for knowledge base, train for training document. Going back to the screenshots, your training documents, perfect to have a screenshot in those. And I'm going to get into that in the next slide. We want to make sure that we're making this in non-technical terms, both internally and externally. It makes it a lot easier to understand by both technical and non-technical people. So when we talk about naming standards, our best practices is if it's a standard operating procedure, we typically will name it, say, working tickets dash SOP, working tickets dash knowledge base, service delivery desks knowledge base. But I might have a training document on how to update a ticket underneath it. Technical SOP is typically used for the technical steps to resolve an issue. So if you're just think if you're having an issue getting into Microsoft, first you're going to want to make sure that the password is correct. You might reset the password. The technical steps to resolve those issues should absolutely be within that document. So you have 6 different kind of documents: SOP, standard operating procedures; templates. Templates are used for client documentation and internal documentation. You have policies, which is information about how we operate, meaning KPIs such as the frequency of how we communicate with our clients. We have a policy that every client must receive a meaningful update every 2 days. A knowledge base is just a list of information about a topic that might be helpful. So understanding statuses on a ticket, understanding the setup of a client's Microsoft tenant. Training helps either the end user or internal employees on a specific process. Those include screenshots and can help training new hires. And then your technical SOP is your technical steps to resolve an issue. The navigation and cross-linking are probably the most important part of the documentation process. When we talk about navigation, we want clear titles and consistency. If I open up a knowledge base article for resolving an error, I need to know that I got to the right document and that the steps are going to help me resolve it. So that may include in the title the error itself as it appears, but it needs to be consistent. Cross-linking to additional best practice articles or related articles. So maybe the article they got to was almost right, but not quite. Maybe there's a better article. It should be linked in some way, shape, or form, either as a link in the document, as related articles down at the bottom. But it really helps streamline how you organize the documentation. And I do just want to make a point that the navigation is not as important as the searchability of each process. Best practices for navigation, each area should be templatized. So if we have an SOP for how to do something, we should have the why, how, when, where templatized in that document. So client documentation articles such as site information, shared drives, access restrictions, network maps, network information, printers, that should all be the same across all clients or all organizations. If you're an internal IT, that should be the same across all departments. Software specific information such as line of business software, critical software should all be templatized as well as who has access to the software. The key here really is consistency. Mm-hmm. Again, the most important part is the searchability. Having keywords, tags, if it allows tags, is the best way to absolutely organize this. I want you to think about the last time you went to go search for documentation on somebody's website. You didn't go through the navigation to try and find the document. Your clients and your team most likely won't be doing that either. So the searchability is the most important. Again, remembering to cross-link to the next article that might be helpful is also critical. Mm-hmm. And making sure that there's a smooth transition here. I want to talk about the 3 layers of processes. The first one is core values. Mm-hmm. Core values are critical, but not the topic of today. They are the ultimate process. And when processes fail or are missing, living up to the core values is a success for everyone. Having the ways to succeed in the middle of the processes is general behaviors that guide core values. That's, again, another whole webinar. Mm-hmm. But then we have the processes. So if an incident occurs and there's no processes and the behavior didn't violate a core value, then there is no incident. Mm-hmm. It means that the process must be created and trained. You have an opportunity to work together as a team, make these processes, and streamline them. So on the Gozynta growth community, we have templates and guides for all major areas of processes, from leadership to HR, finance, IT documentation, marketing, sales, service delivery projects, and KPIs. And we are offering 50% off your first 6 months. The URL is the eurekacommunity.com, and the promo code's on your screen, growth50. On the website, you're going to come to the growth community, and then we have our process chart, which is our recommended implementation of processes, from leadership to documentation, marketing, sales. There's definitely something there for everyone.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's awesome. That's something we're trying to do more of, is just have a lot of documentation, because I think that's a big thing that people are missing whenever they first get into a leadership role. Is it's kind of a mess, and they don't know where to start.
You don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are pre-built processes out there that are fully editable. The key is to tailor it to your individual needs.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some of those like essential processes? So let's say you come into kind of a messy situation, which is something we're going to be covering at the end of April, but let's say there's no documentation. What are some really essential processes that you feel would be a good place to start for someone that's
kind of run into this all the time? Essential processes here: how to work tickets in IT. You need to document your policies. If the policy isn't documented, then it's hard to hold accountability to something that nobody knew about.
Yeah.
And if nobody knew about it, then it needs to be documented. As leaders, there are going to be times that you come in and you're going to be like, where's the documentation? Where? And it's overwhelming. I totally get it. It's one problem at a time. If we're having a problem working tickets, then that's the first one that goes in right after the process. If we're having trouble working or solidifying how we document our clients, second process that goes in.
Yeah.
I mean, we're still documenting processes and they're changing, right? So coming into Gozynta, we have a lot of documentation already there. The key is to start where you are. And if there's nothing, the process goes in first. It gets trained out, and everybody's responsible for creating that process. If you want some kind of handle on it or review process, the documentation review process, again, another webinar, but it consists of 4 different cycles of create, review, edit, gain feedback, and repeat.
Yeah, without getting too deep into it, how often do you think people should or might want to refresh their documentation or processes, or at least reassess it?
Everybody should be reviewing the process as they're working daily.
Okay.
And those edits need to be made in the moment. Now, let me just clarify, because I've gotten a lot of feedback on that one statement. I don't have time. I'm too busy. I'm jumping from one process to another. when you go to train a new team member, or you send the documentation to a client to self-resolve their issue, or a policy that's unclear, you're going to spend more time correcting the issue than you would have just updating it in the moment.
Yeah.
And so the short answer is everybody needs to be looking at it and updating it in the moment. And I totally get that life happens.
Yeah.
If that's the case and we haven't reviewed it in the last 6 months, then it's time to start going through it.
Yeah.
Time to remind everybody that they need to go back through the documentation. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think something I also do, not specifically with documentation, but if I'm in the middle of something and I realize that an update needs to be made or I need to change something, but I can't do it in the moment, then I'll just write it on my to-do list to go check back in on it on a later date or later in the day. Because then I won't forget about it. At least it'll be there documented for me to come back to, because I kind of work off to-do lists and that's the only way I get anything done. And just having a reminder there that even if you can't fix it in the moment, at least you know to come back to it.
Yeah, we have a process improvement meeting. So 30 minutes, you meet with a team, introduce new processes, update, and let them know what changed, if anything changed. Sometimes that meeting is 5 minutes long. Sometimes that meeting is 30 minutes long. Having that open communication as you start getting into your documentation journey, setting expectations, training the team, keeping everybody updated. I totally get that adding another meeting to our already busy calendar can sometimes be non-existent, right? You can't. But what is the cost of somebody failing to follow a process or following an outdated process? And then there's the other issue of I've already memorized the process, so I'm not even looking at it.
Yeah.
And that was hard too, because the policy that's put in place in the process is that everybody is responsible for updating the documentation as they go.
Yeah. And I mean, it's like when I make a recipe and then I do it over time and I keep doing it. And then I start just leaving certain ingredients out because I'm like, I'm too lazy to do that. And then suddenly it's a condensed version of whatever the original thing was, but now it's not the same. And
it's bucket syndrome.
Yeah. And I think that happens a lot. It's just, you're like, oh, I know how to do it. So I'm just going to do it. And then it ends up being something completely different. So.
And then you go back and you look at it and go, oh, that's how it should have been.
Yes, exactly. So I think that it helps to go back to the process and also document whenever you do something so that it's consistent.
It does. If we do have people that are struggling with, hey, outdated documentation, you're not alone. We're all there. We've all done it. We've all got caught up in the day to day, and then you go to give it to somebody, and they're like, "This isn't right," and you go, "Oops."
Yeah.
Now we're spending entire days fixing documentation that could have just been solved in the minute.
Yeah.
If that's the case in your organization, create a project to start revisiting each document to make sure that the steps make sense.
Yeah.
Right. You got to start somewhere, and getting overwhelmed with 250 processes or documents or knowledge base articles, or even your client documentation, right? Step by step. You don't have to do it all at once. you can do it over time.
Right, right. Yeah, it's a lot easier to break up projects like that into smaller bits so that you don't feel overwhelmed. There were a couple of questions that came in. First, Diego asked, what would you recommend for service for templatizing our current existing documentation?
Service for templatizing your which documentation? Internal processes or client?
Yes. So yeah, that's a good follow-up question. Not sure if you mean what if your documentation is currently stored on Google Drive or something, if you're trying to move it to a different thing, or if you're looking for templates. So all of those are good follow-up questions. And while we wait for that, Gabriel asks, is the implementation of documenting strategies different for the text versus sales or marketing?
No, no, it isn't. You may have different implementation meetings for the different various departments, but you alone as an IT leader cannot write 100% of your documentation. You can't.
Mm-hmm.
You as an IT leader are focused on your IT team. Doesn't matter how big or small they are.
Yeah.
Identify your key needs and start there.
Mm-hmm.
Sales and marketing should have their own documentation, and they should have a documentation czar responsible for overseeing those documents. But the
Sweet.
process is the same.
Yeah. Yeah. But it does come down to, as we were talking about earlier, technical versus non-technical documentation and how those might change.
Yeah. The technical documentation I see, the most common thing I see is owners or IT managers that want it done a certain way, and they don't want to delegate that process off to another technician.
Sure.
But all you're doing is bottlenecking yourself.
Yeah.
Let them write it. Let them submit it to you for review.
Mm-hmm.
Then go back and fix it, update it, and you can review it during the next process review meeting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, if you need to, and you have a team meeting already scheduled, save 15 minutes for that process review in that existing team meeting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Hopefully that helps answer it, Gabriel. And then Diego followed up and said, we're currently storing our internal documentation on SharePoint, but as various Word, PowerPoints, and Excel files. Is there a recommended resource for templatizing this?
Oh, it doesn't matter where you store it.
Mm-hmm.
Create a template in a folder, in the main folder,
mm-hmm.
and make sure that everybody is aware of said template.
Mm-hmm.
Your processes are going to be different if you follow the who, what, where, when, how, and why.
Mm-hmm.
It should be very easy to create a template and store it in the main folder.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're storing your client's information, make sure you templatize what you want. If it's the network map, you need to clarify what information you needed, because just blanket network map, there's a lot there.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It could take you 2-3 hours to document everything in that network. What's important? What do you deem important?
Mm-hmm.
And templatize that.
Yeah. And you mentioned broader network map. How would you recommend like categorizing your documentation? Is it how is it categorized based on, is it like technical information or things like that?
Depends. If it's internal and its policies, the way that we have ours is it's broken up by department.
Okay.
So mine is broken up by service, and then I have processes and knowledge base articles, policies for SOP for my work and ticket process. And then I have specific underneath that processes for how to update it in Halo, ConnectWise, Autotask. And then our marketing team has their own process folder, and it's broken down in the same ways. Again, the navigation isn't important. the searchability of that is. And of course, you do have to have some kind of file structure. I totally get it. Plan it out first. And if you're creating documentation for your clients in a SharePoint folder, you should also document how that is.
Mm-hmm.
If you have all the site information in one document, that site information needs to be templatized to make it easier for your text to find.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Like you mentioned, searchability is huge. And if you use some sort of documentation software, so I'm obviously more well-versed in Ninja One, but there are kind of standard templates that you can import, or you can create your own template so that whenever you create new documentation, if you decide to use a separate platform like Ninja One, you could just have that template already ready to go.
Voodoo has the same templatization, so does an IT glue, and various different forms, but there are templatized versions of it.
Yeah. So it makes it a little bit easier. But if all you have is SharePoint, that's totally fine. It's just about, like Brendan said, having that searchability in there.
So let's just be clear: the location matters less.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, clearly you don't want to keep it in your PSA because having the keys to your kingdom and the passwords in the same location just isn't a good idea.
Sure, yeah.
But we've had great success in Google Drive, Confluence, SharePoint. It doesn't have to be in documentation software specific right out of the gate. I've got some clients that love Trainual for their internal processes. As somebody mentioned, using software to capture the screenshots, Scribe.
Yes. Yeah.
These are a great start, but not necessary. It's a good addition.
Yeah, absolutely.
Save it to your local drive. Make sure everybody knows where to find it.
Yeah.
By local drive, I mean SharePoint, Google Drive, whatever.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, well, do you have any kind of additional thoughts, any last words about documentation or creating processes, more importantly?
Yes. When you first start, or you realize that your documentation isn't up to par, don't panic. It happens to the best of us.
Yeah.
Rely on your team to help. Express the importance. As a leader, you need to gain their buy-in and address the with them. What's in it for me?
I have never heard the with them before.
When you address the with them, what's in it for me?
Yeah.
Your team is more likely to follow suit.
Yeah.
When they understand that the questions are going to become less because it's documented. Onboarding new hires is going to be faster because it's documented.
Yeah.
The documents are templatized. But if you're looking at IT Glue and you're like, wow, I have so many clients that don't have these necessary information, that's all right. You don't have to get it all at one go. Start with as you need it, creating those documents. As these processes internally that you need to create for working tickets, categorization, maybe it's how to respond to a client, documenting your statuses and when to use them. Look at your big problems first and start getting it on paper. It doesn't have to be perfect because the perfection is going to hinder you 100%. You can't do processes alone. You have to rely on your team. You should be setting the example as a leader and having your team follow suit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, as Gabriel said, sell it to them. Yep.
Can't do it without their buy-in.
Jesse just said, I just told my director about with them. We'll be using that. So that's good.
Yeah, the whiff them. What's in
Yeah.
it for me?
No, that's great. That's something I've never thought of, and that's very funny. And very, very catchy too. Whiff them. Well, awesome. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate you taking the
Thanks
time
for
out
having me.
to talk about processes. And I'm hoping we can have you back to talk a little bit more about, you know, all of the other things, documentation and things like that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So in the meantime, we have a lot of streams coming up in April. The first is going to be on April 1st. We're going to be talking about imposter syndrome with a few different IT leaders, kind of discussing how to beat imposter syndrome, how to appreciate your successes, and how to make sure the rest of your team also doesn't suffer from the same thing. And then on the 29th, we'll also be discussing how to make the most of a messy IT organization, how to recover from that. And then additionally, in that same vein, we actually have a podcast episode that just came out. It's a new podcast series that we're doing at Ninja called IT Horror Stories. We just had our second one, so that kind of goes along with that same theme of inheriting a messy environment. And so we kind of go through those IT horror stories that people will encounter in their IT journeys, which I think happens to everyone. So at least everyone in IT, they encounter some some bad situations. So definitely check that podcast out if you're ever looking for some folks to commiserate with. So, but yeah, I think that is it for me today. Thank you again, Brendan, for jumping on, and I'll be posting a wrap up of this stream right after, so that we can kind of get all of these resources out in the IT Leadership Hub.
I'm gonna be uploading a template for the process.
Oh,
So
awesome.
be on the lookout for that.
Okay, perfect.
It'll be at sometime this week.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, yeah, really appreciate it. All right. Well, thank
Thank
you
you so
guys.
much.
Yeah, thank you. Take care. Bye, y'all.